30 miles north of the closest interstate, an abandoned mining town stands behind sagging wooden barriers and bent signposts. Years ago, hopeful workers arrived with drills and back-breaking determination, believing they would reap valuable metals from underground veins. Businesses sprang up around the robust operation, and families settled in small houses built along wide, dusty streets. A steady influx of equipment, provisions, and skilled labor turned the settlement into a modest hub of activity. Many thought they would spend their entire lives there. 15 years after the first successful extraction, the mine experienced a catastrophic cave-in that destroyed reinforced tunnels and trapped dozens of miners. Rescue teams struggled to breach the collapsed shafts. The final count of confirmed casualties grew each day. In the aftermath, a deep sinkhole appeared in the center of town. Locals called it the pit. Cracks spread hundreds of yards beyond the initial collapse. Officials declared further excavation impossible. The once busy settlement emptied, leaving behind scattered debris and bleak memories. Geological teams studied the collapse zone, intrigued by unusual plants sprouting where the ground had split. These thick-stemmed specimens had distinct leaf structures loaded with potent enzymes. Laboratories confirmed that the extracted compounds contained potentially transformative medical properties. Pharmaceutical interests took note. Researchers considered the site a biological gold mine. Despite the town's demise, government agencies provided limited security to guard these newly discovered resources. Over time, scientists refined certain extracts into treatments, though unforeseen side effects complicated wider application. Local authorities, pressured by budget constraints, decided to repurpose the deserted cavity. They deemed the pit an ideal containment site for inmates considered unfit to rejoin society. Early prison transports showed little concern for human dignity. Guards forced convicts onto crude metal platforms and sometimes shoved them directly over the edge. Many suffered fatal impacts against protruding rock formations. Public outcry forced a shift to an enclosed wooden elevator, slowly lowering prisoners to the bottom. Politicians described this method as more civilized. Meanwhile, research on the newly identified plants intensified. Basic derivatives cured infections, but stronger formulas produced alarming changes in laboratory animals. Subjects grew larger, more aggressive, and developed heightened sensory capabilities. Over multiple experimental phases, scientists combined the plant-based compounds with genetic material from dogs and wolves, seeking a controlled enhancement of strength or disease resistance. Trials escalated from rodents to canines, and eventually to human subjects. Secret programs funneled certain experimental serums into the pit, using unwilling prisoners as test cases. The authorities did not publicize these tests. Several research sites struggled to handle violent outbursts by test subjects who displayed partial transformations. Some mutated individuals demonstrated canine features and predator instincts, attacking staff or each other. Government overseers decided the pit would serve as a remote laboratory where escaped subjects would remain contained behind the crater's high walls. If atrocities happened below ground, the public would never see them. Prisoners, already considered irredeemable, would be forgotten by society. In turn, scientists gained an endless supply of new test samples. Today, the pit stands as a grim symbol of neglect and clandestine ambition. Iron scaffolding clings to collapsed tunnel entrances. Inmates wander among debris piles, searching for anything to trade or consume. Many carry homemade weapons fashioned from rebar or broken tools. The entire area reeks of damp earth, sweat, and blood. Occasional howls resonate from the far tunnels, but no one rushes to investigate. The watchtowers above remain staffed by silent guards who lower fresh loads of prisoners each month. Few question where these men and women come from, or why some vanish without a trace. The pit continues operating as a hidden nexus of brutality and scientific manipulation, poised to receive more unwitting subjects in the name of progress. A battered truck rattles to a stop near the pit's rim, raising a billow of dust that settles on rows of barbed wire. Several guards in stained uniforms step forward, ignoring the heat radiating from scorching midday sun. They unlatch the metal tailgate, revealing a huddled mass of prisoners in worn jumpsuits. Every occupant appears exhausted or ill. Some cough uncontrollably. Others nurse bruises or limp from untreated injuries. A sergeant waves a clipboard in the air, indicating that everyone must disembark. The inmates shuffle off the truck, chains clinking around their ankles. One man stumbles and falls onto the dirt, scraping his hands. A guard laughs at him, calling him slow. Another inmate attempts to help him stand, but a guard intervenes with a rough shove. No official welcomes exist in this place. Beyond the guards, a chain-link fence borders the colossal drop. Wooden planks and steel beams brace the ragged edges of the crater. The occasional rock dislodges and tumbles down the slope. Most new arrivals stare into that dark void with dread. Two men exchange horrified glances and begin muttering in panicked tones about preferring death to whatever lies below. Their eyes dart toward the fence. Suddenly, those two break away from the line, slipping past a guard who moves too slowly to react. One leaps over the barrier, disappearing from sight. The second hesitates an instant, loses his footing, and plummets after the first. Screams reverberate for a second, then cease. The group of prisoners stands frozen, uncertain whether to interpret this as lunacy or liberation. A corporal smirks. He bets with a fellow guard on how many bones those men broke. The rest are herded onto a creaking wooden elevator that is little more than a platform suspended by thick cables. The operator in a tower signals readiness, and the contraption starts its descent. The entire structure shudders at the added weight. Several prisoners cling to the wooden rail, aware that a sudden malfunction would send them falling into the darkness. Guards remain behind at the rim, chuckling as the elevator sinks from sight. At the bottom, stale air and an overpowering stench greet the arrivals. Distant corners fade into shadow. Crumpled metal frames and sagging walls line the perimeter. Without warning, ragged figures rush toward the new group, clawing at shirts, pockets, and whatever items might hold value. A few inmates try to defend themselves, but they are hopelessly outnumbered. Robbery in the pit happens within moments of arrival, and no guards intervene. During this chaos, two novices scramble away, pressing themselves against a collapsed tunnel mouth. They tremble at the frantic scene, hearing curses and the sound of fists on flesh. One of them steps on a piece of broken glass, curses softly, and stifles a cry. The other tries to calm him. They glance around, searching for a safe route deeper into the warren of corridors. Night settles quickly in the pit, especially with limited lighting. The only illumination above is faint moonlight across the gaping hole. Some hours after the elevator landing, a pitiful moan echoes from the gloom. Nearby survivors realize it must be one of the men who jumped. The moan transforms into a series of strangled gasps. Some onlookers feel compelled to investigate, but fear keeps them back. A distorted silhouette staggers along the rubble-strewn ground. The figure's head tilts at an impossible angle, and its arms dangle. Cries turn into rasping sounds that resonate through the dead air. A guard at the rim, peering through a rifle scope, chuckles at the sight. He wonders how that inmate is still alive. Another guard believes the man will die within minutes. As the watchers argue, the figure below jerks upright, releasing a guttural exhalation. Then it lurches behind a fallen girder. At roughly the same time, several convicts claim to see another shape rising near the spot where the second jumper landed. A survivor swears the second man's skull was smashed open, yet that same body now stands, tottering from side to side and uttering painful groans. Many scatter, refusing to witness more. By daybreak, fragments of tattered clothing remain, but neither man's body is found. Michael no longer remembers the sunlight he once took for granted, nor the smell of fresh air. He navigates the labyrinth of broken corridors with practiced vigilance, always listening for footsteps or clinking metal. He stores modest supplies in hidden spots, hoping thieves never uncover them. He has survived multiple close calls, thanks in part to a partnership with a man named Dixon, who shares both desperation and a willingness to cooperate. Several weeks earlier, peculiar canine hybrids were introduced into the pit. Guards rolled caged containers to an old freight hatch and dropped them into lower tunnels. Rumblings and howls emanated from below. Soon, prisoners went missing. Survivors spoke of dog-like entities prowling in darkness. Dixon is a reserved individual who prefers action over talk. He greets Michael one morning with tense remarks about the fractured state of the pit. In the past, a few major gangs ruled resources, but the introduction of those dog-like monsters dismantled larger groups. Survivors splintered into smaller bands that roam aimlessly. Competition grows, with each faction seeking food, water, or anything that can be traded for advantage. Dixon believes more conflict looms. Michael acknowledges that violence escalates. Yesterday, 2 men were beaten severely for a single can of beans. The pit's supply drops arrive sporadically. Guards throw down crates containing questionable rations. Old water sacks arrive punctured. People fight over scraps. The tension intensifies with every new rumor about half-human beasts. Michael and Dixon discuss the possibility of fleeing deeper into the old mine shafts, hoping to find hidden pockets of water. They realize the risk, as those tunnels might house unimaginable threats. An older inmate mentions that the severely injured man from the recent jump has vanished. Some claim they saw him lurching away during the night, making guttural noises. Another rumor suggests that a second dead individual also disappeared, leaving behind bloody footprints. The pit's inhabitants quietly debate whether unholy transformations result from unscrupulous experiments. Michael tries to focus on tangible dangers, but he cannot dismiss these tales. Dixon likewise remains uncertain about the truth. During midday, Michael notices how restless everyone appears. A minor squabble over a piece of cloth escalates into a stabbing, leaving a scrawny inmate collapsed against a jagged stone. A cluster of onlookers shrugs and retreats, unwilling to get involved. Michael and Dixon avoid direct entanglements. They focus on preserving their limited food and a pair of battered flashlights that sometimes help them search dark corridors. As evening arrives, a fearful hush overtakes the settlement. Groups gather in tight circles, suspecting that the dog-like creatures may attack again. People whisper about vicious howling in the distance. Some older prisoners claim they have never heard such guttural tones before. Michael and Dixon remain near a collapsed passage where they built a makeshift shelter with scrap wood. They wait, alert to every distant sound. Shortly after dusk, an echoing shriek resonates through the canyon-like walls. It fades quickly, leaving no clear direction for search. A handful of desperate souls scurry into the deeper hollows, hoping to avoid detection by anything prowling outside. Dixon grips a metal pipe while Michael maintains watch. They hear sporadic scuffling and occasional moans. The night feels long, though only several hours pass. Before dawn, some convicts discover additional traces of blood near a collapsed stairwell. They also find marks in the dirt that suggest large paws dragging something heavy. Michael listens to the chatter. He has encountered no direct evidence of these creatures, yet the consistent stories prompt him to remain cautious. Dixon remarks that the pit resembles a slaughter pen more each day. When sunlight begins to illuminate the upper edges of the crater, the tension persists. Michael and Dixon venture out to scavenge, hoping to avoid roving gangs. Each turn in the corridor reveals new hazards: a half-buried body, shattered crates, or looming shapes that vanish around corners. The men speak little. Survival guides their actions. The pit's environment devolves steadily. They suspect an ultimate reckoning waits in the bowels of this forsaken hole, where savage beings roam without constraint. Michael and Dixon awaken in their makeshift hideout before dawn. They ration a small portion of water, each taking only a few sips. Their supplies are dwindling. Hunger gnaws at them, but they remain resolute. They prepare to search for anything salvageable in an area rumored to contain old storage rooms. Dixon packs a broken blade he fashioned from a section of steel pipe. Michael carries a short rod with a jagged edge. Moving along a cramped passage, they step over scattered debris. Broken beams protrude from the walls at odd angles. They advance quietly, checking every corner for potential ambushers. Faint torchlight flickers from deeper recesses. Occasionally, a scurrying rodent startles them, but they maintain discipline. The pit's labyrinth demands caution at every turn. Midway through their route, they spot a group of 7 malnourished prisoners huddled near a partially collapsed support column. These individuals appear restless, their eyes darting in search of easy prey. Their leader, a wiry man gripping a blood-stained club, stands at the forefront. He addresses Michael and Dixon in a brusque manner, demanding that they hand over any food or water. His tone implies no negotiation is possible. Michael and Dixon exchange a brief glance. They sense the hostility. When Dixon refuses to comply, 2 of the strangers move forward, attempting to corner him. Michael shifts position, gripping his rod. The tension erupts as the wiry leader swings his club at Dixon, who sidesteps and strikes back with his makeshift blade. Metal hits flesh. The attacker howls in pain. Chaos ensues. 4 more aggressors rush in. Michael knocks one aside with a forceful shove of the rod, striking the man's shoulder. Another tries to tackle Dixon from behind, but Dixon pivots and delivers a quick slash to the assailant's thigh. Shouts fill the corridor. The enclosed space amplifies every sound. One of the attackers stumbles over rubble and crashes to the ground. Another swings a jagged pipe at Michael's head, missing by inches. After a short, brutal skirmish, the group of 7 lies scattered. Several men clutch bleeding wounds. One tries to stand but collapses from exhaustion. Their leader, now sporting a deep gash across his forearm, glares at Michael and Dixon. He threatens revenge, but he lacks the strength to carry out the threat. Dixon breathes heavily, sweat drips from his face, and Michael's arms tremble from the adrenaline surge. Despite outnumbering them, the 7 had little stamina. Weeks of hunger have drained them. Michael and Dixon confiscate a half-empty water bottle that the gang carried. They also take a small portion of dried beans, though the quantity is negligible. They step away from the scene, unwilling to linger. None of the defeated men appear capable of immediate pursuit. Dixon warns that these individuals might attempt retaliation once they recover. Michael nods grimly, acknowledging that the pit spawns long-lasting grudges. Continuing down the corridor, they find a ransacked storage area. Wooden crates lie splintered, their contents looted long ago. Broken barrels and tangled ropes clutter the floor. A distant trickle suggests a possible water leak, but the source seems inaccessible behind collapsed stone. Michael inspects a section of collapsed ceiling, hoping to find anything edible. He only locates corroded scraps of metal that serve no clear purpose. Fatigue sets in. Dixon's arm bears a minor wound from the brawl, and Michael's shoulder aches from a blunt impact. They retreat to a dark alcove, mindful that another roving gang could appear. Dixon wraps a piece of cloth around his bleeding arm, grimacing at each movement. Michael stands guard, listening to echoes and scanning every approach. Their victory brought no comfort. Supplies remain scarce, and new threats emerge constantly. Nightfall approaches as they sneak back toward a safer portion of the pit. Occasional shrieks resonate from distant tunnels. Some might be the dog-like creatures. Others might be human. Nobody can distinguish them anymore. The lines between man and beast blur under the pit's oppressive conditions. Michael and Dixon remain silent, hoping to avoid further skirmishes. They intend to hide in a secure nook until morning. Survival requires that they evade confrontations that drain energy and risk fatal injuries. In the next few days, Michael and Dixon struggle to locate anything useful. They attempt to barter with fellow inmates who possess makeshift medicine or scraps of food, offering meager items like bent nails or a handful of beans. Resources around them are nearly depleted. The pit's confined world grows more perilous with every passing hour. Infections spread among the wounded, and chronic coughs echo in dim corridors. One afternoon, Michael proposes a visit to Wendell, a recluse who brews rudimentary remedies from mold and fungus. Wendell's hideout lies near a partially flooded shaft. His medical concoctions occasionally reduce fever or prevent cuts from festering, though he demands high payment. Dixon agrees that they should try. They pack 2 cans of expired vegetables as possible trade goods and depart their cramped refuge. Their path leads through a formerly active loading area, now littered with shattered crates. Ripped tarps flap from overhead wires. Dixon remarks on the unusual stillness. Michael surveys the surroundings, sensing an absence of the usual scavenger presence. They cross the open space carefully. A thick layer of dust coats everything. Broken glass crackles underfoot. An uneasy calm hangs in the stagnant air. Without warning, shadowy figures emerge from behind a crumpled piece of machinery. These strangers wear mismatched attire, but they carry well-maintained weapons, including metal batons enhanced with nails or sharpened edges. Their faces remain obscured by strips of cloth or improvised masks. They form a perimeter, cutting off Michael's and Dixon's escape. One steps forward, brandishing a baton that appears to be military surplus. His stance is steady. He does not resemble a starving vagrant. Michael senses a dangerous coordination. He attempts to question them, but they rush forward. Dixon parries the first swing, only to be struck on the side by a second assailant. Michael tries to intervene with his rod, but a powerful blow knocks him backward, nearly winding him. The attackers function with organized efficiency, unlike the ragged bandits typical of the pit. Their leader directs quick hand signals. Every movement appears practiced. Michael watches in horror as one masked man plunges a syringe into Dixon's arm, while 2 others hold him down. Dixon convulses, struggling to breathe. Michael lunges to help, but a baton slams into his ribs. He crashes against a broken crate, sending splinters flying. He tries to crawl to Dixon, yet another strike glances off his head, leaving him dazed. A nauseating chemical odor drifts through the air. In that disoriented state, Michael sees two attackers dragging Dixon away. His friend twitches and utters faint groans. The group's leader urges speed. Michael tries to stand but receives a savage kick to his shoulder. He falls again, gasping. The masked men say little aside from short commands to each other. Their objective seems specific: capture Dixon. A portion of Michael's mind registers that they have come prepared for this. When a brief commotion distracts the pair holding Michael, he musters the last of his strength. He twists free, kicking one man's leg, and scrambles to his feet. He glances around for Dixon, but Dixon is already being pulled toward a hidden passage behind a collapsed pillar. Two armed figures guard that opening. Michael knows he cannot fight them alone in his battered condition. He staggers down a side corridor, ignoring the flashes of pain radiating from his ribs. Footfalls echo behind him. Metal clangs against concrete. He sprints along narrow tunnels where the ceiling sags, dodging broken beams and stepping across jagged rocks. The pursuit intensifies, then fades as Michael navigates a twisting path that he memorized during previous explorations. An old ventilation duct leads him into an isolated section of the pit. Eventually, he hears no further sounds of chasing footsteps. With lungs burning and sweat soaking his grimy clothes, Michael collapses in a dark alcove. He blocks the entrance with loose rubble and a rusted doorframe, creating a makeshift barricade. His entire body trembles from shock, and his vision blurs. He realizes Dixon is gone, taken by an organized group whose motives are unknown. Guilt pierces him. He curses his own powerlessness. He sits in silence, formulating a plan to survive and search for Dixon. Trust feels more precious than ever, yet he has lost the only true ally he had. Days have passed since he lost Dixon, and his hopes for assistance fade. During that interval, a series of unexplained disappearances shook the pit. Prisoners of all types simply vanished from their usual corridors. Some re-emerged after several days in a disoriented state, muttering incoherently and stumbling around as if their strength had been drained. Others never resurfaced at all. Rumors proliferate faster than anyone can disprove them. Certain inmates whisper that the abducted are dragged into hidden chambers by dog-like figures, while others insist it must be a new experiment involving tranquilizing chemicals. Sensing that chaos is intensifying, Michael seeks shelter among a small group that has coalesced under the leadership of a gaunt man named Hayes. This group defends a sheltered pocket where old mining equipment is stacked, creating a defensive barrier. Several watch posts are set up at key choke points. Despite minimal resources, these inmates have organized nighttime watches and attempt to keep track of who enters or exits. The climate of paranoia forces them to accept almost anyone willing to fight. Michael offers manual labor and some knowledge of hidden tunnels, so they let him stay under close observation. Before long, talk spreads about strangers returning with pale skin and hollow eyes. One woman in Hayes's group claims she saw a friend reappear near a collapsed corridor, moaning in a flat tone. That friend could not recall any details about where she had been. Her arms bore faint punctures, as if needles had been inserted. She shook uncontrollably whenever questioned. Later that night, she wandered away again without a word. Hayes mobilizes a patrol to chase after her, but they find only a torn scrap of fabric on the ground. The group's morale plummets. Each new day increases tension, partly because the Dogman's presence grows bolder. Scattered remains have been discovered at various corners of the pit. Some show tooth marks consistent with large jaws. Michael witnesses desperation in every face. No one trusts the next person entirely. Alliances form solely for protection. A different cluster of prisoners merges with Hayes's group, bolstering the defensive perimeter. Despite that, more vanishings occur, often in daylight. Guards at the rim do nothing to intervene. Michael understands that staying in one place might lead to the same fate as those who vanished. At first, he considers persuading Hayes to gather a larger force and push deeper, but the Dogman's raids make that option risky. Patrols that venture too far from the group's center frequently lose members to sudden attacks. Some victims reappear as battered shells of themselves, while others remain missing. Michael cannot escape thoughts of Dixon. He wonders if his friend might still be alive, even though many claim that once you are taken by an organized faction, death or worse is certain. Michael struggles with guilt whenever he rests. He imagines Dixon trapped in some hidden chamber, forcibly subjected to the same horrors that produce the mindless captives. That fear compels Michael to stop passively waiting. During a dusk gathering, Hayes calls for volunteers to form a wider reconnaissance team. He wants to identify any pattern behind the disappearances. Few step forward. Most prefer to remain inside the ring of scavenged barricades. Michael volunteers because he sees no other path. Surviving day after day in that anxious environment yields no progress. He hopes the search might uncover evidence about Dixon or the Dogmen. That night, Michael and 4 others embark on a cautious patrol. They skirt areas known to be Dogman territory and check derelict storage rooms. They find scattered footprints, smeared blood, and metal fragments resembling syringe caps. One companion grows nauseous after spotting a half-hidden body with glazed eyes and bite marks along the torso. The group retreats to safety, bringing back the few disturbing items they collected. Morale collapses further when 2 of Hayes's watchmen disappear the following evening. People start believing that nothing will stop the abductions or the bestial raids. Frustration leads to scuffles over meager rations. Hayes's group nearly splits from within. Michael realizes that staying in a large camp offers no true security if the Dogmen or unidentified assailants strike at will. Driven by instinct, Michael decides to withdraw from the group entirely. He plans to slip away and return to the deserted hideout he once shared with Dixon, hoping to locate old caches and wait for an opportunity. He does not announce his intention. Michael travels alone through corridors that echo with distant shrieks. The air smells of rot and stale water. He clutches a crudely sharpened rod as he steps over rubble. He navigates by memory, recalling half-familiar passages that branch near the pit's southern edge. He hopes to reach the cramped spot where he once stored a small quantity of canned goods. At nightfall, he rests behind a collapsed support beam. He hears muffled howls rising from the far tunnels. He senses that multiple creatures move in unison, possibly coordinating a hunt. This is different from scattered sightings in the past. Their cries carry a forced pattern that suggests they are sweeping through sections systematically. Michael feels the tension in his chest. He wonders if they smell his sweat. Before dawn, a thunderous commotion shakes the darkness. Michael creeps forward and sees flickering torches illuminating the perimeter of an entrenched camp. That settlement belongs to a coalition that formed when Dogman raids grew worse. Michael spots silhouettes racing along the barricades, shouting warnings. Moments later, a surge of half-naked, monstrous figures slams into the defenders. Their movements are swift and their snarling roars overwhelm human voices. Michael watches from behind a jagged wall, horrified by how quickly the defenders crumble. The monstrous assailants strike with claws and fangs. They drag convicts away without mercy. Within minutes, the strong points collapse. Michael notices that the Dogmen leave no corpses. They drag every victim into the gloom. Panicked cries echo across the corridors. Fires flicker out as lanterns topple. The chaos is brief, yet devastating. Then the shrieks subside, leaving a ghastly hush. Michael observes a wounded prisoner stumble away from the wreckage. That man's arm is covered in puncture wounds that bleed heavily. His eyes appear unfocused. He collapses not far from Michael's hiding place. When Michael approaches to offer assistance, the man's breathing sounds wet and labored. He cannot speak coherently. His gaze flickers between fear and fury. Michael attempts to bandage the arm using a scrap of cloth. A low growl issues from the man's throat as if something inside him rejects the help. Then his limbs begin jerking uncontrollably. Michael has no medical knowledge that can reverse an apparent transformation. He backs away, uncertain whether to flee or try to calm the man. The convulsions intensify. Bones shift under pale skin, producing sharp cracking sounds. The man's face contorts, and an animalistic rasp escapes his lungs. Michael cannot bear to watch further. He turns and runs, leaving the man to his fate. That confrontation confirms everything. The dogman's bite or claw wound triggers a horrific progression, turning victims into new predators. The infection spreads rapidly, and the pit has become a breeding ground. Haunted by this realization, Michael continues onward. He avoids direct conflict by concealing himself in side tunnels whenever he hears voices or sees movement. He eventually locates the collapsed corridor near his old hideout, but the entire area is littered with debris. While clearing a path, he notices footprints near an opening that leads deeper underground. They appear fresh, suggesting someone has been here recently. Cautious, he inches forward, forced to move debris with minimal noise. Pushing through a narrow gap, he enters the old chamber where he and Dixon once stashed goods. The shelves are intact, though mostly empty. A single can of vegetables remains. Dust covers every surface, and the stale odor indicates no one else has dwelled here. Just when he thinks the place is deserted, he spots a huddled figure lying near the wall. He raises his rod, prepared for an ambush. Then he sees that it is Dixon. Dixon is pale, trembling, and barely responsive. His clothes hang on him like rags. Michael's heart pounds as he kneels beside his friend. He gently touches Dixon's shoulder, unsure if the man is even conscious. Dixon's eyes flutter, revealing partial awareness. He mumbles about a metal door and a painful brightness. Michael cannot decipher the words fully, but he suspects that Dixon endured something far beyond a typical Dogman attack. Outside, scraping sounds echo against the walls. It could be Dogmen sniffing for prey. It could be mutated captives searching for a meal. Michael remains silent, placing a hand over Dixon's mouth to keep him from groaning. Darkness surrounds them. They have no reliable light source, and the corridor resonates with ominous noises. Michael's relief at finding Dixon alive collides with a sense of dread. Whatever happened to him has left him frail and haunted, perhaps beyond repair. Michael watches over Dixon at dawn. His friend's breathing is shallow. His arms and legs twitch at random intervals. When Dixon finally opens his eyes, he seems disoriented, as if torn between memories and nightmares. Michael checks him for obvious wounds and finds no bite marks. However, small needle scars dot Dixon's arms and neck. Questions swirl. Michael tries speaking quietly. "Dixon, can you hear me? Where did they take you?" Dixon's gaze wanders and his speech is slurred. He mentions a metal door and a glaring light. He mutters about unfamiliar men wearing protective suits. Michael struggles to understand, but the words suggest a location beyond the usual tunnels. Dixon appears drained by the effort of talking. He collapses into a trembling sleep. By mid-morning, Michael hears scraping noises outside the chamber. He peeks through a gap in the rubble and sees 3 dogmen prowling the corridors. These creatures appear gaunt but powerful, with fur patches across their shoulders and arms. Their faces bear muzzle-like protrusions, and their eyes remain fixated on the darkness ahead. They move in a pack formation, sniffing at the dust. Michael realizes they may sense the presence of human survivors. He prepares to hide silently, but the dogmen approach the entrance. They utter guttural snarls that echo around the chamber. Dixon stirs and attempts to stand, but he is too weak. Michael braces himself for a desperate fight. The dogmen crouch, preparing to attack. Then Dixon utters a shuddering moan, clutching his abdomen. His entire frame spasms. Muscles bulge unnaturally. His back arches, and he emits a roar that seems deeper than any normal human throat could produce. In front of Michael's eyes, Dixon's appearance shifts. Coarse hair sprouts along his arms, and his features contort into a wolf-like shape rather than a dog's. Unlike the other dogmen, Dixon grows a thicker layer of fur along his spine, and his posture remains more upright. One dogman lunges forward, but Dixon counters with brutal force, slamming the attacker aside. A second tries to clamp powerful jaws onto Dixon's shoulder, but Dixon twists free. Michael backs against the wall, afraid that Dixon's aggression might extend to any living presence. The ferocious transformation continues. Dixon's eyes burn with a savage intensity. The dogmen circle him, uncertain how to proceed. One of them charges. Dixon strikes with a clawed hand, tearing at the creature's torso. The dogman howls and falls back. The others growl, adjusting positions. For a moment, Dixon's attention shifts to Michael. He bares his teeth in a threatening posture, as if ready to pounce. Michael grips his makeshift rod, though he doubts he could repel this mutated form of his friend. Then Dixon freezes. He sniffs the air around Michael and exhales a low rumble. It is neither a friendly greeting nor an outright challenge. The dogmen appear to sense a stronger predator, and they encircle Dixon, as if trying to test him. Dixon's face twitches, then he lowers his stance and emits a guttural command. The dogmen hesitate. Michael cannot parse the meaning, but it seems to carry authority. Instead of resuming their assault, the dogmen begin pacing in a broad arc. Dixon keeps himself between Michael and the pack. He raises one clawed hand, tracing a rough outline in the dust on the ground. It looks like a rectangle with a smaller line beneath it. Then he scrawls the word, "Go." Michael realizes Dixon is granting him a chance to leave. He interprets it as a directive. Find a door, get out. The dogmen remain uneasy, but none attack Michael directly. Dixon utters a short, sharp growl, as if instructing them to stand down. Then he steps toward the corridor, beckoning Michael to follow. Michael, still trembling, inches behind Dixon. He notices that Dixon's mind has not been destroyed by the transformation. Something of his human awareness persists. Together, they exit the chamber. The dogmen close ranks, but do not tear Michael apart. They regard Dixon with something akin to respect or fear. Michael's mind reels with questions. Dixon's monstrous form towers over the standard dogmen, and his silver-flecked fur stands out against their dull coats. The group proceeds through the half-lit passageways, leaving behind the collapsed hideout. Michael feels stunned by the abrupt shift. Minutes ago, he expected to die in a hopeless confrontation. Now he follows a mutated ally who appears to command lesser beasts. Dixon leads Michael through corridors that slope downward, then twist upward again, forming a complex network of forgotten shafts. The ragged dogmen follow several yards behind, seeming reluctant to challenge Dixon's dominance. Michael keeps quiet, observing how Dixon navigates passages he should not logically know. They pass rusted gates, partial cave-ins, and shafts that appear long abandoned. Occasionally, Dixon pauses to check the air, sniffing for danger. More than once, they encounter stray dogmen prowling intersections. Those creatures step aside, letting Dixon and Michael pass without incident. Michael wonders whether they sense the presence of a stronger predator. The journey feels surreal. He and a mutated friend, accompanied by feral beasts, roam labyrinthine depths once excavated by miners. No guards, no human gangs, only the quiet drip of water and the distant scuttling of rodents. After covering at least half a mile, they reach a dead-end wall. Dixon places his clawed hands on the cracked surface and scrapes away layers of loose mortar. A portion of the stone collapses, revealing heavy metal doors behind it. Rust mottles the hinges, but the doors remain sealed. Dixon drives his shoulder against the seam, causing the frame to groan. He repeats the motion until the corroded lock breaks. The doors swing inward, revealing an ancient stairwell that spirals upward. Michael steps forward cautiously. He shines his weak flashlight on the steps, noticing dust and footprints. He wonders who last traveled this route. Dixon gestures for him to ascend, and the dogmen linger at the threshold, unwilling to climb higher. Michael suspects they dislike leaving the pit's depths. Dixon, however, does not hesitate. He starts up the steps, still in his mutated form. The spiral path is cramped and winding. They climb for many minutes, occasionally stopping to rest. Dixon's breathing is ragged, and Michael notices dark scratches on Dixon's arms, likely from the earlier fight. Fresh blood seeps through the matted fur. Michael says little, uncertain whether Dixon fully comprehends human language at this point. Dixon stares back with a mixture of determination and pain. Near the top, they emerge into a large, dimly lit chamber. Broken machinery lines one wall, and a collapsed segment of ceiling lets in faint light from above. Two massive figures guard an open space near a heavy grate. Their forms are larger than the standard dogman. They stand upright, at least 7 feet tall, with powerful limbs and thick necks. Michael recognizes them instantly. Weeks ago, he watched guards push massive iron crates over the edge and heard the crash as these monsters landed in the depths. Later, he and Dixon narrowly survived a brutal encounter when these very brutes roamed the tunnels and attacked without mercy. The pair emits low growls, stepping forward aggressively. Dixon roars back, but his injuries hamper him. One of the hulks lunges, slamming Dixon into a concrete pillar with incredible force. Michael tries to intervene with his metal rod, but the second giant swipes him aside. Michael tumbles across the floor, feeling pain in his ribs. Dixon recovers enough to tackle the first creature, and they crash together against a pile of scrap. Claws and teeth tear at thick hide. Dixon's fury is evident, but he is smaller than these older beasts. The second monster charges again, forcing Michael to roll behind a rusted gearbox for cover. He rises unsteadily. The creature lurches forward, but Michael jabs the rod at its flank, causing it to flinch momentarily. In that brief interval, Dixon delivers a punishing blow to the first giant's head, slamming it into the concrete. Bones crack. The wounded giant collapses, but the second tries to clamp its jaws around Dixon's arm. Dixon howls, writhing in pain as teeth grind against flesh. Michael strikes the giant's back with all his strength. Although the blow barely pierces thick fur, it distracts the creature enough for Dixon to twist free. Dixon seizes the giant by the throat, employing an immense surge of power. They stagger toward the edge of the chamber, where a gaping drop leads back into the pit. Dixon strains every muscle, lifting the gargantuan foe off the ground. The giant flails, but Dixon drives him over the ledge. both giant dogmen plunge downward. One lands with a horrifying crash far below. The other tries to cling to a ledge but loses its grip and disappears into the darkness. Dixon collapses to one knee, blood seeping from deep wounds. Michael rushes to his side, supporting him. Together they limp toward a short flight of steps leading past the heavy grate. A battered door stands open, revealing a corridor that leads to the surface. No guards remain at this hidden exit. Michael and Dixon step through, emerging into open air for the first time in an age. Gray sunlight washes over them. Behind them, the pit's open maw extends downward like a chasm of misery. Freedom beckons, yet Dixon struggles to stand, trembling under the weight of his injuries. Cool air greets them as they emerge onto the deserted rim. Chain-link fencing sags beside a rusted guard post, and no one mans the observation towers. Dixon leans heavily on Michael, each labored step an ordeal. His fur remains bristled, and his breathing is ragged. They reach a concrete barrier where remnants of barbed wire lie tangled in heaps. Beyond it lies open land dotted with scraggly weeds and scattered boulders. The horizon stretches for miles under a pale sky. Dixon lowers himself onto a broken slab, gazing at the distance as though recognizing that a normal life is no longer possible. He emits a strained whine, unlike any human sound. Michael tries to help him stand again, but Dixon pulls away, his gaze full of sorrow. For a moment they lock eyes. Michael senses that Dixon is choosing a path of self-imposed exile rather than further existence in that hybrid form. Before Michael can speak, Dixon staggers back toward the edge, looking down into the pit's unfathomable drop. A faint wind rustles the debris. Michael shouts, "Wait, don't do this." He lunges forward, trying to grab Dixon's arm, but Dixon jerks free. With a final mournful glance, Dixon leaps into the void. Michael rushes to the brink and peers downward, screaming his friend's name, but no response rises from the depths. The only sound is the dull rush of air against the crater walls. Michael collapses to his knees, tears burning his eyes. He has escaped the pit, yet the cost has been staggering. He feels unmoored, uncertain where to go next. The surrounding region is deserted, with no sign of government patrols or local inhabitants. His sorrow at losing Dixon overshadows any relief about standing in open air. After several minutes, he musters the will to move. He limps away from the pit, scanning the area for a road or a landmark. Meanwhile, at an undisclosed facility, a row of monitors displays high-resolution camera feeds from multiple angles inside the pit. Military personnel in fatigues stand at attention while scientists in pristine lab coats review the recordings. One screen shows Dixon's final leap, captured by a camera mounted near the old guard station. Another screen replays the clash with the giant dogmen. The lead scientist strokes his chin, evidently impressed by the raw data. He addresses a subordinate. Phase 2 has generated more conversions than we projected. The dogman population has increased, and the modified wolf strain achieved higher cognitive retention. The subject designated Dixon demonstrated the ability to preserve partial memory, plus advanced motor skills. He also displayed unique territorial dominance over standard dogmen. We must locate him, even if his current status is uncertain. A uniformed officer queries the viability of retrieving Dixon from the crater. The scientist shakes his head. We suspect he survived the fall, given the regenerative characteristics observed in the wolf strain. Also, he may wander the tunnels or escape through alternate routes. We need to track him discreetly. Instruct the perimeter squads to avoid harming him. Our interest is purely research-oriented at this stage. We have not completed analyzing his blood panels. Another scientist glances at a screen featuring Michael in partial silhouette, moving across the pit's boundary. She remarks, "That man accompanied Dixon. Their bond might be valuable." We can observe how emotional ties influence hybrid behavior. The lead scientist nods, insisting that Michael be monitored. He is not a primary target, but we cannot let him disappear. If Dixon resurfaces and seeks him out, we must be prepared. The overhead lights flicker in the facility's control room, revealing charts of infection rates, genetic breakdowns, and estimated population changes. Subordinates take notes, planning the next phase of field testing. Quiet agreement prevails. The experiments will continue. The pit, though terrifying, remains an isolated environment for unrestrained trials. No major oversight threatens to intervene. The government has little incentive to shut down what it considers a contained program. Back at the crater's rim, Michael wanders along a narrow gravel path, grieving and numb. He contemplates heading north, uncertain whether to risk official highways or remain in backcountry terrain. With each step, he remembers Dixon's final expression. That memory hurts more than any physical wound. A single question propels him forward. How can he expose the truth behind the pit, and who would even believe him?